41 minutes. That is how long a masked man spent inside the home of a missing grandmother in Tucson, Arizona. 41 minutes breathing, shedding DNA, making mistakes he thought no one would ever discover. His mouth was uncovered. His mustache was visible. And for 41 minutes, he contaminated every surface he touched with biological evidence that modern forensic science can now read like a confession. 76 days later, that evidence sits inside the FBI laboratory at Quantico. A single strand of hair, rootless, microscopic, the kind of evidence that 10 years ago would have been catalogued and forgotten. But today, in 2025, that hair can tell investigators exactly who was inside Nancy Guthrie's locked home between 1:47 and 2:28 in the morning on February 1st. It can identify a specific human being. And when it does, it will either clear the last person to see her alive forever, or it will destroy the alibi that is held for 76 days. The man on the doorbell camera thought he was careful. He wore gloves. He wore a mask. He disabled the security system, but he left his mouth exposed. And that one mistake, that single point of failure in an otherwise calculated crime, is about to unravel everything. This is the story of how a grandmother vanished from her own bedroom without a single witness, how her blood ended up on her front porch, but her body has never been found, and how the most advanced DNA technology in the world is now hunting the person who thought they got away with it. If you want to know what happens when forensic science catches up to a criminal who underestimated a rootless hair, stay with me, because what I am about to show you is not speculation. It is the verified timeline, the documented evidence, and the countdown to the moment when silence becomes testimony. Like this video right now, subscribe to True Crime Files, and let me take you inside the 41 minutes that are about to solve this case. The morning of February 1st, 2025, should have been ordinary. Nancy Guthrie was known to participate in her church's Sunday live stream service. Her friends expected to see her online that morning. When she did not appear, they grew concerned. Calls were made. Messages went unanswered. By late morning, Nancy's family had been notified. By early afternoon, they were standing at her front door. When the Pima County Sheriff's Department arrived shortly after noon, they found something that turned a welfare check into a crime scene. Blood. Small droplets on the front porch. Not a large amount. Not the kind of blood pattern that suggests violence happened there, but blood, nonetheless. And when forensic testing came back days later, the DNA confirmed what everyone already feared. The blood belonged to Nancy Guthrie. Inside the home, investigators found her phone. They found her wallet. They found her daily medications sitting exactly where they should have been. Everything that an elderly woman would need to leave her house was still there. Everything except Nancy herself. Her car was in the garage. The doors were locked. There were no signs of forced entry, and yet Nancy Guthrie was gone. By February 2nd, the Pima County Sheriff's Department had reclassified the case. This was no longer a search for a missing person. This was a criminal investigation. Sheriff Chris Nanos stood before the media and said the words that made this story national news. Evidence recovered at the residence indicated that Nancy had been taken against her will. Homicide investigators had been brought in. The FBI was now involved. And the question that no one could answer was this: how does someone vanish from their own locked home in the middle of the night without leaving a trace beyond a few drops of blood? To understand how investigators are trying to answer that question 76 days later, you have to go back to the last night anyone saw Nancy Guthrie alive. And you have to start with the timeline that Sheriff Chris Nanos himself put on the record. A timeline so specific that it is measured in minutes. A timeline that begins at 5:32 in the evening on Saturday, January 31st. Nancy Guthrie left her home in an Uber that evening. The destination was her daughter's house, approximately 10 miles away in Tucson. Her daughter Annie and Annie's husband Tomasso were hosting a family dinner that night. It was a normal gathering. Dinner, games, conversation, the kind of evening families have when they live in the same city and want to spend time together. Authorities have confirmed they spoke with the Uber driver who took Nancy to that dinner. That driver has been cleared. Nancy spent the evening with her family. She ate, she played games, and, at approximately 9:48 that night, Tomasso Cioni, drove her home. The vehicle was a blue Honda CR-V registered to Annie Guthrie and Tomasso Cioni. Sheriff Nanos has confirmed the exact time Nancy arrived back at her house because it is documented by the timestamp on her garage door. The garage door opened at 9:48 p.m. It closed 2 minutes later at 9:50 p.m. Those 2 minutes are a verified fact. What happened during those 2 minutes is where the public record becomes narrow. Sheriff Nanos has stated publicly that Tomasso Cioni made sure Nancy was safely inside. That is the language. Made sure she was safely inside. What the sheriff has not established is how long Tomasso remained at the property after the garage door closed, or whether he entered the house beyond the immediate entryway. The 2-minute window belongs to the garage door mechanism, not to Tomasso's movements, and that distinction matters, because after 9:50 p.m., the documented timeline of Nancy Guthrie's night becomes a story told by machines, digital logs, motion sensors, Bluetooth connections, and the eerie silence of a home that should have been occupied by a woman preparing for bed, but was instead occupied by someone else entirely. For several hours after 9:50, the house was quiet. There were no reports of unusual activity from neighbors. No one called 911. No one knocked on a door asking for help. The security camera on Nancy's front porch, a Google Nest doorbell device, recorded nothing out of the ordinary. And then, at 1:47 in the morning on February 1st, that camera disconnected. At 2:12 a.m., 25 minutes after the camera went offline, the device's software registered motion. A person was detected on the property. But because Nancy did not have an active Google Nest Cloud subscription, no video was retained by the camera at that exact moment. The motion was logged. The presence of a person was logged. But the footage that should have captured who that person was appeared to be lost. At 2:28 a.m., 16 minutes after the motion detection, Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker disconnected from her phone. That disconnection is significant. A pacemaker communicates with a monitoring application via Bluetooth. When the device moves out of range, the connection drops. At 2:28 in the morning, Nancy's pacemaker was no longer within Bluetooth range of her home, which means at 2:28 a.m., Nancy Guthrie was no longer in her house. 41 minutes. That is the window. From 1:40 to 7 a.m. when the camera went dark, to 2:20 to 8 a.m. when the pacemaker signal was lost. 41 minutes, during which something happened inside that home that ended with a 70-something woman being removed from her own bedroom in the middle of the night. When the FBI became involved in the case, one of the first things their technical team did was attempt to recover the footage that appeared to be missing from Nancy's doorbell camera. Even though Nancy did not have a cloud subscription, even though the camera itself had not stored the video locally, there was a possibility that residual data existed somewhere in Google's back-end systems. The FBI brought in private sector partners who specialize in digital forensics, and they were successful. The footage they recovered is the single most studied piece of evidence in this entire investigation. On February 10th, FBI Director Kash Patel personally authorized the release of 4 night vision surveillance images and 2 short video clips. The person those images captured is the reason this case has remained in the national conversation for 76 days. A man, masked, armed, standing on Nancy Guthrie's front porch in the early hours of February 1st. He was wearing a ski mask, but his mouth was exposed. He had gloves on his hands. He wore what appeared to be a full bodysuit over his regular clothes. He carried a black Ozark Trail hiker pack, 25-liter capacity, and he had a handgun, holstered in an unusual position directly over his crotch. The footage shows him approaching the doorbell camera. He taps at it lightly, as if trying to dismantle it or disable it. When that does not work, he reaches out and breaks off pieces of foliage from a potted plant sitting on the porch. He uses the leaves to cover the camera lens. He believes he has solved the problem. He believes he is no longer being recorded. He does not know that the data will be recovered from back-end systems 9 days later and released to the public by the director of the FBI. On February 12th, the FBI released additional descriptive details about the man in the footage. He stood between 5 feet 9 inches and 5 feet 10 inches tall. He had an average build, and he had a visible black mustache. That same day, The FBI raised its reward for information leading to Nancy's recovery from $50,000 to $100,000. That man, whoever he is, spent 41 minutes inside Nancy Guthrie's home, and according to one of the most respected criminal profilers in the country, he made mistakes that no professional would ever make. Jim Clemente is a former supervisory special agent with the FBI and a criminal profiler who has worked hundreds of cases over a 30-year career. When he analyzed the doorbell camera footage shortly after it was released, he focused on something specific, a marking visible on the suspect's right wrist. Clemente stated publicly that he believed the marking was a tattoo, not a bracelet, not a watch. A tattoo, on the underside of the right wrist. That kind of identifier, Clemente explained, becomes extraordinarily valuable once tips start coming in, because a tattoo is something that can rule people in and rule people out. It is a permanent marking that cannot easily be hidden or changed. And the fact that this suspect, who went to considerable lengths to avoid leaving evidence, exposed a visible tattoo on camera, told Clemente something important about who this person was. Speaking on Fox News Digital, Clemente said that the suspect had taken the time to wear at least one mask, possibly two. He wore gloves, possibly two pairs. He wore a full bodysuit, but he left his mouth uncovered. And that, Clemente said, was a catastrophic error, because for 41 minutes inside that house, this man was breathing. He was exhaling saliva. He was shedding DNA from his exposed mouth, from his eyes, from his eyebrows, from his eyelashes, and from the visible hair of his mustache. In a separate appearance on News Nation's Brian Entin Investigates, Clemente went further. He said that until the doorbell footage was released, the person investigators believed had taken Nancy appeared fairly sophisticated, someone who planned, someone who knew what he was doing. But the footage changed that assessment. This was not a professional. This was someone who made amateur mistakes. Mistakes that left biological material all over a crime scene he thought he had controlled. Clemente's exact words were these: he was breathing out DNA for 41 minutes in that house. His eyes, and his eyebrows, and his eyelashes, and some of his mustache hair were all exposed. That could have fallen out and been left at the crime scene. So he made a lot of mistakes that really lower his criminal and forensic sophistication. Another former FBI agent, a woman named Maureen O'Connell, analyzed a different piece of evidence: the blood on Nancy's front porch. O'Connell appeared on the same program and explained that the pattern of those droplets told her something specific. She did not believe Nancy walked out of that house. She believed Nancy was carried. Her reasoning came from the absence of what forensic investigators call void patterns. A void pattern is a space where blood should have fallen but did not because something was blocking it. A footprint, a standing body, an object. The blood on Nancy's porch fell in a concentrated area with no voids, no footprints in the blood, no gaps where someone had been standing. The droplets, O'Connell explained, were consistent with a pattern created when two people carry someone between them, with the victim's head tilted in a position that allows blood to drip to a single spot. O'Connell's direct conclusion, as reported by Newsweek, was this: she believed Nancy Guthrie was carried out of her home by two people, not one, two. If that analysis is correct, then the man on the porch was not alone. And if he was not alone, then someone else's DNA should also be inside that house. Someone else who has not yet appeared on any camera. Someone else who has not yet been identified. If you are still with me, if you are following this case because you want to see justice for Nancy Guthrie, then do me a favor right now. Subscribe to True Crime Files, hit the like button, and drop a comment telling me where you are watching from, because this case has traveled far beyond Tucson. People in New York, London, Sydney, Lagos are following this story. And the reason the pressure on this investigation has not faded after 76 days is because people like you refuse to let it fade. So, tell me where you are. Let me know you are still here. And let me show you what happens when forensic science catches up to a criminal who thought he was smarter than the evidence he left behind. On February 16th, day 16 of this investigation, Sheriff Chris Nanos made a public statement that should have ended one line of speculation permanently. He cleared the Guthrie family, all of them, every sibling, every spouse, In his exact words, the Guthrie family, to include all siblings and spouses, has been cleared as possible suspects. The family has been nothing but cooperative and gracious, and are victims in this case. To suggest otherwise is not only wrong, it is cruel. That clearance remains on the record. It has never been withdrawn. It has never been qualified. The family, according to the sheriff, gave investigators everything: their cars, their phones, their computers, their statements, and on March 16th, a former SWAT team leader named Chad Eyes, citing a law enforcement source he described as reliable and affiliated with the investigation, reported that every immediate family member had passed polygraph examinations with flying colors. That polygraph claim has not been officially confirmed by the Pima County Sheriff's Department. It has not been officially confirmed by the FBI, but it has been reported by credible voices in the true crime community, and it has been repeated by multiple analysts covering the case. Nancy Grace has stated publicly on her own program that she does not believe the Guthrie family is responsible for Nancy's disappearance. Former FBI agent Jennifer Coffindaffer has publicly defended Annie Guthrie on social media, calling online speculation against her baloney and pointing to verified quotes of love between the sisters as evidence against theories of jealousy or motive. So if the family has been cleared, if every member passed polygraphs, if the sheriff himself has told the public to stop pointing fingers at victims, then why are we talking about Tomasso Cioni? Why does his name keep appearing in discussions about this case? Why does the blue Honda CR-V he drove Nancy home in matter 76 days later? The answer is not because Tomasso is a suspect. The answer is because Tomasso was there. He was at Nancy's home on the night of January 31st. He walked her to the door. He made sure she was safely inside. He is the last documented person to see Nancy Guthrie alive. And in a case where the central forensic question is whose DNA belongs inside that house, the DNA of the last person who was there becomes the baseline against which every other profile is measured. This is not an accusation. This is the structure of the investigation. The FBI laboratory is not testing hair to determine whether Tomasso Cioni's DNA is in Nancy's home. By the verified public record, some of it may be expected to be there. He was there. He was in the entryway. He was at the door. The laboratory is testing to determine whether someone else was there. Someone whose DNA should not be in that house at all. Someone who does not have an innocent explanation for why their biological material ended up on a carpet, on a countertop, on a surface that was later processed as part of a homicide crime scene. And the reason Tomasso's name has not disappeared from the public conversation is because of what happened to his car. The blue Honda CR-V that Tomasso Cioni used to drive Nancy home on January 31st was impounded by the Pima County Sheriff's Department shortly after Nancy's disappearance. This is documented. What is unusual is what happened to that vehicle while it was in custody. On March 10th, investigative reporter Dave Mack, appearing on Nancy Grace's Crime Stories podcast, revealed that the vehicle was at a mechanic shop, still in the custody of the Sheriff's Department, and was being put back together after what he described as an exhaustive search. By March 11th, the Sheriff's Department confirmed to Parade magazine that the car had not yet been returned to the family, but that the process of returning it had begun. No firm date was given. By March 18th, Brian Anton of News Nation reported that the car required repairs at a dealership because the forensic examination of the vehicle's electronics had somehow disrupted the onboard systems. Let me repeat that. The car required dealership-level repairs after the forensic examination concluded. The vehicle was not simply searched, it was dismantled. Electronics were downloaded. Systems were disrupted to the point that a certified dealership had to be brought in to restore functionality. And as of the last publicly verifiable status, the car was being returned to the family through that dealership. Former FBI agent Maureen O'Connell was asked about this on the February 27th episode of The Megyn Kelly Show. She was asked why a cleared family member's vehicle would be held for so long. Her answer was direct. She said she had processed hundreds and hundreds of cars in her career, and investigators only keep the ones that are involved in some way, shape, or form, or have some sort of evidentiary value. You do not keep a car from a member of the victim's family, she said, unless you have a reason. O'Connell did not accuse anyone. She did not say the car contained evidence of guilt. She flagged the unusualness, the length of time, the depth of the examination, The fact that a vehicle belonging to a cleared individual was subjected to a level of forensic scrutiny that required it to be taken apart and rebuilt. Bob Kragier, a former Pima County Sheriff SWAT commander, offered a more neutral explanation when asked by Parade. He suggested investigators were probably collecting fingerprints, DNA, and electronic data from the vehicle's sensors and onboard computers. He pointed out that maintaining chain of custody on important items is part of building what he called a rock-solid case. That explanation is reasonable. It is standard practice. But it does not explain why the car was held for weeks. It does not explain why it needed dealership repairs. And it does not explain why, if Tomasso Cioni has been cleared, his vehicle required the kind of forensic processing that is typically reserved for suspect vehicles in active homicide investigations. Both things can be true. The vehicle can have been held for standard evidentiary reasons. And the length and depth of that examination can have been unusual. Those two observations do not cancel each other. They sit next to each other in the public record. And they have kept people asking questions for 76 days. On April 16th, ABC News published a story that changed the direction of this entire case. On April 17th, News Nation correspondent Brian Anton confirmed it on social media and then in detail on his program. Hair evidence recovered from inside Nancy Guthrie's home had been sent to the FBI laboratory at Quantico for advanced analysis. Not new evidence, not recently discovered evidence. Hair that had been collected in February, in the days immediately after the crime scene was processed. Hair that had been sent to a private forensic lab in Florida, the lab that Pima County contracts with for routine DNA work. Hair that had sat in that Florida lab for 11 weeks before finally being transferred to the FBI. The FBI itself issued a public statement clarifying the timeline. The Bureau had requested this material over 2 months ago. The Pima County Sheriff's Office had routed it to Florida. And 11 weeks later, the sample was finally where it probably should have been from the beginning, at the nation's most advanced forensic laboratory. Nobody from the Sheriff's Department has publicly explained why the evidence spent 11 weeks in Florida before it reached the FBI. Sheriff Nanos has said that the DNA recovered from the scene is mixed, meaning it contains genetic material from more than one person. Mixed DNA samples are notoriously difficult to analyze, especially if the contribution from any single individual is small relative to the others in the mixture. The sheriff has acknowledged that the Florida lab reported challenges with the sample. But 11 weeks is not a standard turnaround time. 11 weeks is a delay. And in a case where a grandmother has been missing since February 1st, every week matters. What makes this development so significant is not just that the FBI finally has the evidence. It is what the FBI can do with that evidence that the Florida lab could not. C.C. Moore is a genetic genealogist. She is the chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs, and she is known to millions of people as the star of the ABC documentary series The Genetic Detective. On April 9th, she appeared on Brian Enton Investigates to explain exactly what the FBI laboratory is capable of doing with hair evidence that until very recently was considered forensically worthless. For most of the history of criminal forensics, if you found a hair at a crime scene, and that hair did not have a follicular root attached, you could not extract nuclear DNA from it. You could test it for mitochondrial DNA, but mitochondrial DNA only identifies the maternal line. It tells you what family someone comes from, but it cannot tell you which specific individual in that family left the hair behind. A rootless hair, the kind that falls out of a scalp naturally, the kind that ends up on a sofa cushion or in a carpet fiber, was considered useful for exclusion purposes but not for identification. That has changed. C.C. Moore credited the work of Dr. Ed Green at a company called Astrea Forensics, which has developed technology capable of extracting nuclear DNA profiles from rootless hair, technology that did not exist in usable form a decade ago, technology that the FBI laboratory now uses regularly. Moore was explicit about what this means for the Nancy Guthrie case. The man who was inside Nancy's home for 41 minutes had his mouth exposed. Jim Clemente said he was breathing out DNA. His mustache was visible. His eyebrows were visible. His eyelashes were exposed. For 41 minutes, he moved through that house shedding biological material. hair from his mustache, hair from his eyebrows, skin cells, saliva droplets from his breath. All of it landing on surfaces that were later processed as part of a crime scene. If even one rootless hair from that man ended up in the evidence collected from Nancy's home, the FBI laboratory can now extract a DNA profile from it. A profile that identifies a specific human being. A profile that can be run through law enforcement databases. A profile that can be uploaded to public genealogy databases and traced back through family trees to identify an unknown individual. A profile that will answer the question this investigation has been unable to answer for 76 days. Who was inside that house that should not have been there? The FBI laboratory has 4 specific capabilities that become decisive in a case like this. The first is kinship analysis. Kinship analysis allows investigators to determine whether a DNA profile belongs to a close relative of a known individual. It can rule out family members, including Tomasso, even if their DNA happens to appear in a mixed sample. It can also determine whether an unknown profile is related to any family member in the case, which would be critical information, if true. The second capability is investigative genetic genealogy. This is the field C.C. Moore herself pioneered. Investigative genetic genealogy uploads a DNA profile to public databases like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, searches for familial matches, and then uses genealogical research to trace the family tree outward from distant cousins back to the unknown individual. Moore told Brian Enton that if a person leaves their DNA at a crime scene, they can, and eventually will be identified through this method. How long it takes depends on the person's ancestral background and how well their family is represented in the databases. But it works. It worked in the Golden State Killer case. It has worked in dozens of cold cases since, and it will work here. The third capability is low-template DNA analysis. The ability to generate profiles from trace amounts of biological material that regional labs and private contractors cannot resolve. A single skin cell, a microscopic saliva droplet, a rootless hair that contains only picograms of nuclear DNA. The FBI laboratory can work with samples that would be turned away by almost any other facility in the country. The fourth capability is mixture deconvolution at federal standard. This is the specific technical process that the Florida lab appears to have been unable to complete. Mixture deconvolution separates individual DNA profiles from a sample that contains genetic material from multiple contributors. It is a mathematically complex process that requires sophisticated software and experienced analysts. And it is the reason the hair evidence sat in Florida for 11 weeks before being sent to the one laboratory in the United States that specializes in exactly this kind of work. C.C. Moore told Brian Enton that she suspects a company planning to release new mixture deconvolution software rushed its timeline because of the Nancy Guthrie case. Her belief is that this case has made advanced DNA analysis a top priority for the entire forensic science field. The technology is evolving in real time, and the FBI laboratory is at the center of that evolution. Every one of those 4 capabilities is pointed at a single question. Whose hair is inside Nancy Guthrie's house that does not belong to someone who was supposed to be there? The FBI laboratory is not trying to determine whether Nancy's DNA is in the sample. It is her house. Her DNA is expected. The laboratory is not trying to determine whether Tomasso Cioni's DNA is in the sample. He was there on January 30. First, he walked Nancy to the door. By the documented public record, some trace of his presence in the immediate entryway may be expected. What the laboratory is doing is working outward from the known contributors: Nancy, Tomasso, Annie, any other family member who had been in that home in the days or weeks before January 31st. The deconvolution process identifies those profiles, accounts for them, and isolates what remains. And what remains, if anything remains, is the profile of someone who should not be there. Someone who does not have an innocent explanation. Someone who was inside that house during the 41 minutes between 1:47 a.m. and 2:28 a.m. on February 1st. If that profile exists, if the FBI laboratory can separate it from the mixture, then investigative genetic genealogy will identify the person it belongs to. It is not a question of if, it is a question of when, because the science works. The databases are large enough. The family trees are deep enough. And the people who do this work do not stop until they have a name. If that profile does not exist, if the only DNA recovered from the crime scene belongs to people who were expected to be there, then the investigation has a different problem. Because the blood on the porch is Nancy's, the doorbell camera footage is real. The pacemaker disconnect is documented. Something happened inside that house. Someone was there. And if the DNA evidence does not identify that person, then investigators will have to rely on something else: witness testimony, digital forensics, behavioral analysis, the kind of investigative work that takes months or years instead of weeks. But right now, 76 days into this case, the forensic question is still the most important question. And the FBI laboratory is the only institution in the country capable of answering it. I want to come back to something Maureen O'Connell said on the Megyn Kelly show in late February, because in the context of where this case stands today, her words carry a different weight than they did when she first spoke them. O'Connell said that if there is more than one person involved in this case, which she believes there is, they are now in an air fryer, and it is just a matter of who is going to jump out first. Her point was this: large rewards destabilize co-conspirators. $1 million changes lives. Someone at the edges of a conspiracy, someone whose involvement was tangential, someone who was pressured into participation, someone who drove a car or held a door or helped dispose of evidence, reaches a point where the reward exceeds the loyalty. The Guthrie family has offered $1 million for information leading to Nancy's recovery. The FBI has offered $100,000. Tucson Crime Stoppers has offered an additional amount. The combined total is approximately $1.2 million. $1.2 million is enough money to fracture a partnership. It is enough money to make someone reconsider the risk they are taking by staying silent. It is enough money to turn an accomplice into a witness. And if Maureen O'Connell is right, if Nancy was carried out of that house by two people, then one of those two people is sitting somewhere right now doing the math, weighing the value of $1.2 million against the probability that forensic evidence is about to identify them anyway. The FBI laboratory does not negotiate. It does not make deals. It processes evidence. It generates profiles. It identifies individuals. And once that identification is made, the leverage shifts. Because, at that point, cooperation is no longer voluntary. At that point, the person whose DNA is in that house has a choice: talk first and potentially reduce your exposure, or wait for the second person to talk and lose the only advantage you had. O'Connell called it an air fryer. I would call it a countdown. And the timer started the day that hair evidence was transferred to Quantico. 76 days. That is how long Nancy Guthrie has been missing. 76 days without a confirmed sighting. 76 days without proof of life. 76 days during which her family has endured a kind of torture that most people cannot imagine. Not knowing whether she is alive, not knowing whether she is suffering, not knowing whether the person responsible is someone they trusted or someone they have never met. Savannah Guthrie returned to her anchor desk at the Today Show on April 6th, after a 2-month absence. It was the first extended time she had taken away from the broadcast in her entire career at NBC. The producers at Today have reportedly implemented a protocol to remove her from the set if breaking news in her mother's case arrives during a live broadcast. That is the level of care required to allow a woman to do her job while her mother's face is on missing person posters across Arizona. The ransom demands that were reported in early February have led nowhere. A $4 million demand with a deadline of February 5th. A $6 million Bitcoin demand with a deadline of February 9th at 5 p.m. Neither deadline was met. No payment was made. No proof of life was provided. Bitcoin activity in the wallet associated with the demands has been described as inconclusive. TMZ continues to receive notes claiming to have information about Nancy's location, including one that placed her in Sonora, Mexico, 70 miles south of Tucson. The FBI has not validated or invalidated any of those notes. What remains is the evidence: the blood on the porch, the footage of the masked man, the 41-minute window, the pacemaker disconnect, and the hair sample now at the FBI laboratory. If you have made it this far, If you are still watching, if you care about what happened to Nancy Guthrie, and you want to see this case resolved, then I need you to do something. Subscribe to True Crime Files right now, like this video, and share it with one person you trust, because every share widens the circle of people who are paying attention. Every subscription is another person who will be here when the FBI laboratory releases its results. And in a world where an elderly woman can vanish from her own locked home in the middle of the night, staying informed is how you protect the people you love from the same nightmare. The FBI is accepting tips 24 hours a day. The number is 1-800-CALL-FBI. That is 1-800-225-5324. The reward is $1.2 million. Anyone can call, anyone can provide information, and anyone can be the person who finally brings Nancy Guthrie home. What I have walked you through in this video is the documented timeline, the verified evidence, and the forensic capabilities that are now being applied to the single most important biological sample in this entire investigation. I have not speculated. I have not accused. I have not named a suspect, because law enforcement has not named a suspect. What I have done is show you the structure of the question that the FBI laboratory is trying to answer. Is the DNA recovered from inside Nancy Guthrie's home the DNA of someone who was supposed to be there? Or is it the DNA of someone who was not? If it is the DNA of a family member, including Tomasso, then the cleared status established on February 16th stands. The forensic evidence confirms what the polygraphs reportedly indicated and what the sheriff publicly stated. The family is not responsible. The perpetrator is someone outside that circle, and the investigation continues in a different direction. If it is the DNA of someone who should not have been in that house, someone whose presence cannot be explained by an innocent visit or a family relationship, then that profile will be developed. It will be run through databases. It will be traced through genealogy, and it will produce a name that will either match the man on the porch or a second person who has not yet appeared in any footage, or someone entirely unexpected. Either outcome moves this case forward. Either outcome brings the investigation closer to resolution. And either outcome will be determined by the work happening right now in a laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, where forensic scientists are extracting nuclear DNA from a strand of hair that until very recently would have been considered worthless. 76 days of silence. 76 days of waiting. 76 days of a family living in the worst kind of uncertainty. That silence is about to break, because the science does not wait. The databases do not sleep. And the person who left their DNA inside Nancy Guthrie's home on the night of January 31st is about to be identified. The only question that remains is whether that person knows it yet. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. If you have any information, call the FBI. 1-800-CALL-FBI. $1.2 million is waiting for the person who finally tells the truth. This is True Crime Files, and this case is not over.